So, what do three politicians, a public sector chief executive, an academic, someone from Facebook, and an online troublemaker have in common? Well, it turns out, well, there's a number of you might put in that category, David, as your colleagues in the panel. It turns out they have an interest in openness and an interest in open government. So I'd like to introduce our panellists, Professor Miriam Lips from Victoria University of Wellington, Claire Curran, MP for Dunedin South, Mia Garlick from Facebook, Julie Ann Genter from the Green Party, and Nikki Kay for National Party, David Farrer, who we all know and love, and last but not least, and in disguise, not looking like a public servant today, the Chief Executive of the Department of Internal Affairs and the Government Chief Information Officer, Colin MacDonald. So as you've heard from Pierre and from Vikram, in some ways open government has gone from kind of an activist movement, both activists inside and outside government, to kind of core business for government in just 4 years. In some ways, as Vikram said, we've been opening government for just as long as government has existed. And as you know, New Zealand now has a declaration on open and transparent government. For those of us who've been immersed in this space, who've been living and breathing it for years, it just kind of makes sense. But outside that community of people, it really means a lot of different things. And there's probably a lot of unanswered questions and perhaps a lot of confusion about what does open government mean. So as has the movement progressed, I'd like to take us back through a journey kind of from the theoretical to the practical in terms of open government. Socrates said that the beginning of wisdom is the definition of terms. So I'm going to ask, what do we mean by government and by open and by opening government? So I'm going to ask Professor Miriam Lips to make some opening comments and ask some questions, and then I'm going to get the panel to respond to those. We'll then kind of move from definitions to what we're doing well and what we could improve on in New Zealand and what the practical next steps are. So over to you, Miriam.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Julian. I also believe it's very important to ask some fundamental questions at this stage of the development of open government today, as we seem to be making good progress in comparison to other countries, but perhaps some further progress can be made if we are becoming more reflective on where we are today and what we can do tomorrow. So the first very important question to be asking ourselves, I think, is what does open government mean today and what should it mean in the future? And if we stay with that normative question for a moment of what open government should mean and use the definition of government as was provided by us by former US President Abraham Lincoln already in 1863, government of the people, by the people, and for the people, which comes close to what Ned Torkington remembered us about this morning. Hei tangata, hei tangata, hei tangata. We may ask ourselves whether open government should be any different from government, or this definition of government. Another important question to ask is, if we look at the current promise of open government, it promises that it offers people the opportunity to be better informed, to monitor government on the basis of that information, and ask government better questions so that it can improve its services and also its policy making. In other words, it promises us to close the feedback loop between government and society. The question here is, have we closed that feedback loop yet? Or are we moving into that direction? And what can be done to make some further progress? Third interesting area comes from research in the UK and the US. And that research indicates that open government in those countries is mainly the business of the following groups of actors. First of all, a small and motivated group of civic hackers. Secondly, an engaged and well-resourced group of skilled government bureaucrats. And thirdly, political leaders, such as Obama and Gordon Brown, providing an important mandate to open government. And this raises the question of what is actually the situation in New Zealand? Who is involved in open government and who should be involved? And if the situation in New Zealand would be similar to the UK and the US, it could mean that New Zealand has a so-called data divide. And data divide we could see as similar to how we define a digital divide. A situation where we have and have-nots, so people lacking the hardware and software tools to access open government. A situation where we have can and cannots, people lacking the skills to access open government. And a situation where we have no and no-nots, people lacking the understanding of open government and open data. So if we were to acknowledge the existence of a data divide in New Zealand, what could be done to overcome these gaps? Another important question, does open government mean that data should only be released by government? Or do other organizations, such as NGOs, private sector, have an active role to play in the release of perhaps even open government-related data sets as well? So what do we think about that? And finally, and this has been mentioned by other speakers before, open government can also be seen as similar to an open innovation process. And for successful open innovation to happen, it's important to create the right conditions of being able to experiment, having resources to do so, to learn from mistakes in a safe environment, and to share learning, positive and negative, with others. So the question for open government in New Zealand then is, how can we achieve these conditions in the New Zealand public management system? What needs to be changed? So I would like to give the floor to the others on the panel to perhaps provide some answers to these questions.
Thank you, Miriam. So I'd like to invite each of the panelists to respond. We want to have some time for questions from the audience. So I'm going to ask you to limit your response to around 2 minutes and to respond to any really of those questions that Miriam has helpfully raised. So we'll just go in that order. So starting with Claire.
Thanks. Okay, I'll try and be brief. Firstly, I've got a question. And the question is for you. If I was to ask you to put up your hands if you agree with this, trust me, I'm a politician. It's okay. Be honest, be honest. Cool. I'm not offended, but it kind of illustrates something. If I was sitting up here and I was a doctor and asked that question, I wonder what the response would be. I'm in my 4th year of Parliament, and I'm no longer bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and coming in and thinking I can change everything in a minute. I've been blooded a few times, haven't I, David? But I stood to change the way that we do politics, and I'm not the only one, but it's not that easy, because there's a cynicism towards politics and politicians that is vast, absolutely vast. And in last year's election, around 1 million people didn't vote. Why didn't they vote? Because they were disenfranchised, they were turned off, they were busy, and they didn't see it as being an important thing that they should do. And I think that what that does is show us how vast the problem is around what true open government actually is and means to people. That's the bad news. The good news is that there has been some progress, and I actually, first of all, I just want to acknowledge Pia for the amazing work that she has done with Kate Lundy to be a real thought leader and a driver in this space, and to give us inspiration on this side of the ditch. And I also want to give a big tick to the government around the open data, the work that they've done around open data. Because I think that there has been an enormous shift in the last few years around making information more available through that declaration of open and transparent government. And there's been some tremendous progress in that area. But open government isn't just about open data. It's also about citizen-centric services, and I also think there's been some progress in that area as well, although I've got some real reservations around some of that progress, particularly if it's used to shift frontline services or face-to-face services to create more of a divide between people, particularly people who are vulnerable, and services such as through call centres and that sort of thing, and calling that some form of more open government. The thing I really want to touch on, though, and this is around participative democracy, because to me, as a politician, that is the most important thing, and I know it might not be for everyone on this panel. Hopefully, my parliamentary colleagues, it is actually important, and I do also want to give them a shout out, I suppose, because we have managed, and I don't know how many of you remember, but if you were at last year's NetHui, there was a challenge put to us politicians on the panel to work together on some issues, and we have been. And I think Nikki and Gareth and I have been working on a number of issues, and I think Nikki will probably talk about that in a minute. But I think there's some serious issues around how we do participative democracy that lie before us. There's a wall of indifference that I really grapple with about what are the right points for government to listen and respond, and how do you know when is the right time to do that? The stuff that's going to come out on the Official Information Act, I'm really looking forward to hearing about, because it may be easier for people to make applications for the OIA, but actually getting that information out of government is really hard. And if you don't ask the right question, it can take months and sometimes years to get that information out. Around decision-making, how government decision-making takes place, and the transparency around that, around honest engagement and real honest engagement, and not lip service that's being paid to that. Labor, and I'm not, you can ask me questions if you want to. Labor has been doing a lot of work and thinking around this area. We've created a portfolio called Open Government, and I hope that when we're in government, we will create a ministry, a minister that has responsibilities in that area. That is progress, but there's still a lot of work to do, and I acknowledge that we are left with a lot of questions. How do we all up our game as politicians? How do we do better politics personally? How do we demonstrate real participative democracy and still get things done? Because there's tensions between those two things, and I don't have all the answers, but I'm keeping on with my mission.
Thank you, Claire. The natural thing to do would be to let the other politicians on the panel respond, but I'm just going to keep going in this order, because I think Claire's raised some interesting questions, certainly about engaging people. And want to introduce to you Mia Garlick, who's Manager Communications and Policy at Facebook for both Australia and New Zealand. She's based in Sydney, but prior to Facebook, she was Assistant Secretary Digital Economy in the Department of Broadband Communications and Digital Economy, and has been a counsel to both Google and Creative Commons. So someone who's worked inside and outside government, and who might give us some interesting perspectives about some of the questions that have been raised. So over to you, Mia.
Thanks. And like Pia, I talk fast, so I should be able to get out a lot of information in a very short 2 minutes. I mean, this is going to sort of be an interesting, different perspective in between the political leaders here. The way that I sort of look at this is that the way that people are getting their information is changing. If you ask most website owners where they're seeing the increase in the traffic, the referral traffic, they're increasingly seeing that coming through social platforms. And so what that means is that really technology is kind of now doing or allowing people to do what we've been doing for years offline, which is namely sharing information through personal recommendation. So it's kind of like word of mouth at scale. And we all know from the offline world that when somebody recommends something to you personally, it has a deeper resonance. So I think there's tremendous potential there for government to start engaging in these platforms and having these conversations with people in really meaningful ways. But I think it poses a number of challenges for government. When I was working for government, I was on the Government 2.0 task force, and we had a lot of these conversations within the task force and also with other agencies, and we've started to see that being played out now as we're all trying to grapple with this phenomenon. And I think one of the big challenges is traditionally government is very used to sort of operating in that kind of broadcast media style. You write the press release, you write the media release, you have the quote from the minister, you have the quote from someone else, and then you have the key points that you want to get across in the media contact. Or you write the policy paper, and it's this very well laid out document that's 40 pages long, and could someone please download it as a PDF? Thank you very much. And I've said my piece on that issue. But if you want to actually talk to people and get their respect on a social platform, you need to really think about talking to people in a very different way. The data shows that the shorter a post is, the more likely that people will engage with it, share it with their friends or comment on it. And of course, if people start resharing and commenting and liking on most social platforms or retweeting, then that's going to amplify your message and get it out to more people and start leveraging that word of mouth. And also, images, visuals often resonate more strongly. So these are very different ways, I think, to engage for a government, and I think that presents some challenges in terms of what is the voice of government in these platforms. And so I think the two things that I would want to leave it with for when governments want to start, when people want to start engaging in these platforms, you have to ask yourself two questions. Why would someone care, and why would they share?
Thank you. I'd like to now ask Julianne Ginter from the Green Party to respond to any of the things that have come up so far.
Kia ora koutou. I guess I'll start by going back to that original question of the bigger picture question, what do we mean by open government? And I was interested to note that Vikram in his presentation said that the Greens mentioned transparency but not participation, because one of the four main principles in the Green Party Charter is actually about democracy, and that is, we call it appropriate decision making. And what that's all about is that decisions should be made by or informed by the people who are directly affected by those decisions. And that is very profound implications for all Green Party policy. The idea is that the more people we have participating who are being affected by a decision, the better informed that decision is going to be, the better outcome it's going to have. So in order to achieve that, we need a whole lot more transparency in government, and we need a lot more information to be available. So I guess I'd say that the Green Party doesn't only want to be in government to implement our smart green policies, but we want to fundamentally change the way that government works, because we know that if it's permanently more accountable, more transparent, and truly participatory, that's going to be the basis of good, sustainable decision making for all of us. So the Green Party's taken a couple of steps. We've got two members' bills, actually. One has just passed its first reading, and the other one is probably going to pass its first reading in our next sitting session. And one of them is the Pecuniary Interests of Judges bill, and the other one is our Lobbying Disclosure bill. So both of those are about increasing the transparency of what interests are influencing decision makers, whether they're in the judiciary or whether they're in Parliament. We also are very, very interested in the Law Commission's upcoming report on the Official Information Act because, actually, I was going to say, the way the Green Party functions as a party, our policy is actually informed by any member who wants to be involved. We operate on a consensus basis, and it is possible to make decisions by consensus, having a lot of different people involved. And so in our own party processes, it's really important to get that information from a lot of different sources. So in our party policy is all published on the web, so you can go there and look and see how our detailed recommendations for reform of the Official Information Act, and it'll be interesting to see if the Law Commission agrees with us. So data is, and access to government data is one way that we can increase and improve transparency and enable better participation. So it's necessary to have that open data, but it's not sufficient. And as Pia mentioned, I think we need the attitude to be one of openness towards different points of view and sharing information. And there is some tension there between open, free access to information and sharing and civil liberties and privacy. So that's something that we have to be very, very aware of. But I think those issues are quite manageable. So it'll be interesting to see what opportunities we have with new technology and platforms for improving and increasing both access to data and information and enabling greater participation. But, you know, the technology alone isn't going to do it. We actually need government agencies, parliamentarians, and local government to have that mandate to actually participate, to be open, and to have the reasoning behind their decisions very clear and out there for the public to assess, evaluate, and feedback on. And I guess I'll leave it at that for now, but thank you.
Thank you. As we've heard, the current government has made some quite substantial progress in this whole space. And in August last year, the Minister of Finance, Bill English, launched the New Zealand's Declaration on Open and Transparent Government. So I'm going to ask Nikki Kay, who's the National Party Member of Parliament for Auckland Central, to respond to what she's heard, but also to tell us where the current government is going to be taking us next in this space.
Oh, thank you very much. Kia ora. Look, what I wanted to do, because we've not got much time, was to touch on a couple of areas where I see there's real opportunity for change. And some of them have obviously been mentioned today, but also to just finish off with, some of you will be aware that I called for a parliamentary inquiry into digital literacy and 21st century learning environments, and how I see that potentially having a huge impetus for change in terms of open government. The first area that I want to touch on is the parliamentary process, and we've obviously already heard the sheet around what political parties have, how many Twitter accounts, etc. I think one of the areas that Claire and Gareth and I have been working on has been the parliamentary precinct and how we can make that more open. So one initiative that I am pleased to talk about today is the streaming of select committee hearings. So I believe actually one of the areas where a lot of work happens, a lot of collaborative work happens between members of parliament, and I acknowledge how many of you didn't put up your hand in terms of MPs, is the select committee process. And I've had a huge amount of good feedback actually from people when they go through that process. It's not always a good experience, but generally people can see a lot of collaborative work come out of that. And so I can confirm, and I know that David Wilson is in the room today, I just acknowledge you from the Office of the Clerk, that they are doing a pilot around streaming of select committee hearings. And obviously there will be constraints around that pilot, but I think it's a really exciting development, and that's something that Claire, Gareth and I have worked on. The second thing that I would like to say, and I really put this challenge out to you, is that I think there's a huge amount of participation that happens at a social media level in terms of the political process, feedback to MPs, feedback around policy and legislation. And the challenge that I have put, and Gareth and Claire and I have talked about it as well, is from a parliamentary process perspective, is there a better way to formalise the feedback that we get via social media through the select committee process? Now that could just be that someone sitting in this room can develop an app that means that, you know, all the Twitter feeds that are made on a hashtag to whatever the piece of legislation or whatever the inquiry is comes through to us. But I think that would be another development that we could do that would, I think, formalise and encourage more, particularly young people that I meet who will never formally put in a submission via an email, but they might send a tweet to us. So that is another area that I'm really interested in. Happy to talk to anyone afterwards, and I'm sure Gareth, Claire and I can look at that. So that's sort of around, just a couple of comments around the parliamentary process. I think the other thing that has obviously been mentioned by a couple of people today is that citizen-centric services, and I know that Stephen spoke this morning, and I think that I'll just make a couple of observations about that. I think there are a few things that can drive that. The first comment that I'd make, that I've probably made before, I think, at a previous NetHui, is around how siloed governments across the world can be, and just the reduction of the number of agencies can lead to, I think, much greater collaboration. So whatever you want to call the new super ministry, there is an opportunity there to have more citizen-centric services just by the fact that there are less walls between the policy development process. The other thing I'd like to sort of, the point that I'd make around particularly the public service, and this sort of comes into the education side of it, is when we've been doing this inquiry in terms of digital literacy in 21st century environments, the couple of big messages that come through, a lot of this has to do with culture. And if I think about one of the greatest things that we could do in New Zealand, I think to change the culture and be able to collaborate more, and that word collaboration is used a lot, and be able to share ideas, I think it is around our education system. And technology is a tool, and there are issues of access to technology, and that's something that our select committee are looking at. But one of the biggest things that we're talking about is how we invest in teachers, principals, how we raise awareness of parents to be able to use technology to be able to share ideas. And I sort of feel that if we are able to deliver some quite good things, greater things in terms of our education system, because we've got to remember that when we talk about open government, actually our education system is $9.6 billion of our spend, and that is a key part of our government. We've got 300,000 children there that if we can ensure that, and I sort of say, raise their digital literacy by 5%, ensure that their culture and the way that they operate is about sharing ideas and having and sharing data, then the public servants of the future, rather than having this discussion about how we might make sure that public servants are more open, how we might make sure that political leaders are more open, then I think, you know, you sort of solve the problem if you get that right in your education system. So that's an area that I'm also hugely excited about and working on. And then, you know, finally, the last thing that I would say is, I think this the issue of transparency and accountability. And I think there is an amount that goes on, but there's still a huge amount. And some of the things that, you know, obviously we've talked about our public sector targets, but part of, and I know that Colin will talk about the data side of it, but part of that transparency and accountability is culture, but also part of it is about actually being very clear about what you want to deliver. And I think when we look at those public service targets, it's about saying, well, if we want citizen-centric services, and we want New Zealand citizens to be at the heart of the delivery of those, then we need to be clear about what it is we actually want to deliver to them, because what tends to happen is you just set up a government agency or you set up a government department, rather than saying, well, how is it that we're going to let all of these agencies deliver this one particular thing, whether it's helping more vulnerable kids or whether it's reducing crime. And I think that is an interesting shift that has happened, and I think that is potentially exciting as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. We might not always have trusted or always trust our politicians, but I think seeing politicians across three parties working together in a non-partisan way on topics like transparency of the parliamentary process and openness of parliamentary process, to me seems like one of the things that does have enormous potential to build trust in our politicians. While we might not have always trusted our politicians, we do, as a country, trust our public servants. New Zealand has one of the lowest levels of corruption in the world. So I'm going to break my rule about going along the panel in a linear order in order to give David Farrer kind of the last word.
I won.
And to ask us some challenging questions and comment on where we might do better before we open to general questions from the audience. So, to the man who really is responsible for implementing a lot of the job of opening government, where opening is a verb rather than a noun. I'd like to ask Colin to tell us a bit about what is being done, what is going to happen next, what are the challenges, how do we deliver on this vision of openness and transparency that our elected representatives have framed up for us today. So over to you, Colin.
Kia ora koutou, and all in 2 minutes.
You can have a few more than that.
You'd like me to answer that in 2 minutes? Look, we're not even going to get a chance for questions at this rate. Thank you, Nat. You were quite right to tweet that to us. I will be very brief. So what we're trying to do, I guess, is a couple of things. One is continue to put out open government data. And that's been really interesting. I've been very pleased to have been heavily involved in that over the last few years with a number of people in this room that I'd like to thank for showing me the way of the truth and the light. Because what it has revealed to me is that the opportunity that open data presents for citizen participation, for tailored service delivery, for a whole bunch of things is enormous. Now, we must be careful not to confuse open data with opening up people's personal information. Those are two entirely different things. But I do think some of the skills and the abilities and the lessons that we learn with open data can actually be applied to different ways that citizens might want to access their own data with their own permission. So I think there's some great lessons to be learned there. And I think in the end what it says to me, 1 minute 25 into my 2 minutes, is that there is a real opportunity here to harness the IT industry and people who, I'll just declare myself as a dinosaur. So I've got a degree in computer science from Glasgow University in 1980. Yes, they did do computer science in 1980, folks, and I got a degree in computer science. And I'm struggling to keep up with some of the technologies, some of the ways that people are taking information and doing fantastic things with it. And so if I'm struggling to do that, the rest of the public service is struggling to do it, as is a lot of industry. So opening up data and making it available so that really clever people can come in and do really clever things with it, I think has enormous power. And that's what we're going to be doing.
Thank you, Colin. So I'll note that we did start this session late, and so we will be running through to 20 to 6 rather than 5:30. So as our good friend Nat Talkington has said on Twitter, there will be time for questions. I'd like to hand over to David, perhaps to start the process of asking questions and setting some challenges about where to from here, and then we'll have some roving mics and have questions from the floor.
Sure, thanks. I've reduced my 5 points to 1 point, so I've got some chance of doing the term. I just want to first touch on what Claire talked about. I like that term, participatory democracy, because traditionally there's been two sorts of democracy, representative and direct democracy, which the Swiss have, a few states in America, all decide by referendum. And I think we're on a bit of a revolution. The whole idea behind representative democracy has been that the MPs are the people who we send to Parliament to do the hard work, to become experts on the issue, who get access to the information to then make the informed decisions. But in the open government era, we're getting to the degree where citizens can access all their information, can become just as well informed on bills, and in some cases even more well informed. I think this is going to change the fundamental nature of our democracy over time, that you've got the equaliser of the field. The one initiative I'd like to put out there relates to the second greatest achievement, and don't ask me what the third was, of the last term of the Muldoon government. I'm referring to the Official Information Act. And that was a groundswell change, because up until then, all information was classified unless someone said there's good reason to unclassify it. And what it said is all information is public if someone asks for it, unless there's a good reason to keep it secret. Now, what I would say we're at the stage of is we should take that one more step and say that all major government information should be released proactively by the government without even waiting for someone to ask for it, because we don't know what we don't know, what's out there. Now, there's a couple of caveats there. One is you need some sort of time delay, maybe 6 months. I've worked in PM's office. Cabinet has to be able to make decisions with a certain amount of time to themselves. But I think you could have a time limit where after, say, 6 months, all cabinet level and higher information is just automatically put out there on the internet, on a website, so all the citizens have access to it, and over time you could look at perhaps going down to below cabinet level too. So I think fundamentally a change in the OIA from if you ask for it, we'll give it to you, to here it is, would be the thing that I think could make the biggest difference. Thank you.
As our good friend Nat Talkington has implied on Twitter, we've got time now for questions, but if we allow everybody a 2 to 5 minute response to the first question, we're only going to get one question out. So I'm going to open the floor to questions and just give the panel the opportunity, just 1 or 2 people per question to respond. So it's going to be a bit of a random selection, and we'll see how we go. So who has a question for the panel? This gentleman here, if you want to just speak loud or approach the mic, even better.
In danger of becoming repetitive, I was wondering what the role of open and rigorous peer review and evidence would play in open government.
Thank you. So who would like to respond to that? It's a challenging question.
I think it's for the MP, probably.
Question.
Well, it's important. So is that a yes? That's a yes?
How is it something that we might get better at?
Well, to be honest, actually, I think we do quite a lot of it anyway, and you guys do it to us. And we, you know, the open mechanisms that we're using via social media particularly are continuous forums for peer review, really. If you want to formalise it, you know, that would be something to think about. Labour's talks quite a lot about accountability, internal accountability, and within our party and to our party membership. And so there's a kind of, to some degree, a peer review that goes on, but it could certainly be improved, and we are talking about that. I think you've got to have some measures. The ultimate measure is that you don't vote for us.
Thank you. Julianne or Nikki? Would you like to add anything further to
I'll
that
just
point?
say that there's definitely rigorous peer review, but it's just not necessarily open. So, I mean, I think I'll just make two comments about that. One is, if you're talking about MPs comparing each other or having some kind of performance framework, is that what you're...
My main thrust was about the evidence, because we've been talking about open review. My main concern is the quality of the input you're getting. There are such things as facts, and I think we need to be able to differentiate between good evidence and bad.
A couple of things around that. There's some work that partly the Prime Minister appointing the Chief Science Advisor was about bringing greater evidence-based policy into government. And I think there is a discussion that has been happening around, at least within the public service, how we ensure we have better evidence-based policy. And there's a bit of a challenge there, because some people would say, well, and I think some countries implement this, they have independent science advisors, which are effectively looking at what the evidence is around particular policy. There's a tension because some government departments would say that they want that to happen internally. So I think there is a framework issue there around government and around what a system may be to have better evidence-based policy. The issue of how you make that more open, I welcome suggestions on that.
Thank you.
I've just been thinking about specific examples. I feel like the question is so big. I'll just have to say, yeah, we support evidence, we support peer review, we support things being open. Thinking specifically about transport policy, for example, it's extremely difficult to get any information out of the NZTA or the Minister's office about the evidence they've used to make their decisions. And I think that is because it wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. So I think openness in and of itself is going to provide an incentive for things to be robust, but we probably do need to do some thinking in specifics as to how we get the peer review formalized as part of the policy development process. But I think just openness in and of itself and participation will assist.
Just one other observation, and that's around the policy development process. So there's policy development that happens in government, and then the political parties each have different mechanisms for how they develop policy. I know within the National Party we have policy advisory groups, and we are having discussions. I mean, we have people that come in, talk to those policy advisory groups. We have different people that from different sectors that sit on them. But I do think that when we discuss this topic of open government, we can't forget the role that political parties play in that development, because we talk a lot about the public service and possibly elected politicians, but I think that is also an area that we probably need to do more in terms of being more open.
Can I just say that, just being frank though, ideology is not always evidence-based.
I think that's perhaps definitionally true, Claire. So we've heard some themes about public engagement, deliberative, participative democracy, and from that last question, some real themes about evidence-based policy. And they're perhaps the area where open data starts to contribute to the greater benefits that come from that. So if we'd been on this panel sort of 4 years ago, we might have been talking about government opening its data to be a bit more transparent. We're now talking about government opening its data and being more deliberative and opening up political processes in order to get much better results. I note also that we've been talking a lot about peer review, and that Peer War noted that that we should just perhaps do peer review, and that's quite appropriate because peer's actually been quite a guiding force in terms of helping us understand how to do open government well in New Zealand. I think we have time for one more question and some responses. Over to you.
Oh, I'd very much like to ask a black hat question about open data. And the question goes like this. It's that There are two long-standing examples to me of where we've made our data open and open to the private sector, where it provides no benefit to New Zealand or the New Zealand government. And one of those would be the ceding of our legislative publishing and case law to private international publishers. And the second would be the issue of New Zealand standards, which by and large have been created by New Zealand people and New Zealand companies, and yet they're hidden behind a paywall, and the deleterious effect that that has on the ability of small businesses to use the kinds of standards which should be available for them to use in order to run their businesses to good standards. So two really important examples, and I see that one of the downsides of open data is that that model is followed again and again with other data sets. Mm-hmm. Thank you. So just some comments.
Thank you. So we may have made a whole lot of progress, but there are still some challenges and barriers. Some of those might be legacy issues of the past. Some of those might be tensions between different ways of doing things. I'd like to invite anybody on the panel to respond to that question.
I know a wee bit about the legal issue, and my understanding is that sort of well before the open data days, the rights has been granted for certain legal publishers to have that near monopoly. There has been a project, which I think has been the longest project in the public sector ever, called the Public Access to Legislation and Laws, which I think everything that could go wrong has gone wrong with it. There is now a quite good legislative website which has all the laws on there. So they've made some progress, but in terms of what you're talking about, which is the full annotated case law and everything, I think that's a great example of the sort of open data that government should be actually providing in the future. You shouldn't have to be paying huge subscriptions to an Australian firm.
Thank you. Any other responses, Colin?
Yeah, I mean, I think this does talk to one of the key issues with open data. I mean, philosophically, the idea is that if you open the data up, given that generally speaking taxpayers have already paid for it anyway, and then there's a question about third-party fee payers, but that's a whole different issue. If it's already been paid for, then it should be available to New Zealanders to then access and do what they want to do with it. And I think that's a philosophical position you either take or you don't take. The question then is, do you then cherry pick and say, actually we won't let this one out because we think it's better for government to hold that and try and make money out of it? I think the answer is no. The answer is get the licensing framework right. And Creative Commons is an excellent comprehensive licensing framework that would protect us from, exactly the issue that you raise. Get it out there because the value that will be derived is likely to be much greater. So it's about getting the licensing framework, so using NZ Goal as a way of protecting the IP that sits in there.
Thank you. So we're going to need to bring this panel to a close. The room does need to be repurposed for the next session. So I'm just going to give Miriam Lips the opportunity to reflect on what we've said and have, I think people are gesturing towards Nat. Okay, I will...
I wanted to talk about Standards New Zealand just really quickly.
Nat,
so their business...
briefly.
Very quickly, less than 2 minutes, I promise. Standards New Zealand's business model...
Politician 2 minutes, or...?
...is to charge, yes. Not a political 2 minutes. Standards New Zealand's business model is to charge, thank you, Colin, for access to the standards that were generated. Some of those standards, not all of them, are incorporated into law, so there are legal consequences for not following documents that are not publicly available. So we've declared that that's abhorrent for the laws of our land, but there are standards incorporated into the laws, into the legal code, that are not as open as the laws themselves. And I think this is a bug. It's a bug caused by the business model of Standards New Zealand, which is up for review at the moment by the MED, and they're taking submissions. So if you also feel that this is perhaps a bug and should be remedied, I strongly suggest that I'll tweet the link and using my remaining 46 seconds. Thank you.
Thank you, Nat. While Pia Waugh may be a peer reviewer of government, I think in the open government context, Nat is the conscience of, or at least the kind of annoying Nat that's pushing us to go further and working out where we're actually not doing well. So I think that one in particular is perhaps a challenge for the non-partisan efforts that the elected representatives here today, and perhaps more of them, can work on together. Like now to just give Miriam a minute or two to kind of sum up and present us some challenges going forward.
Well, it's quite a challenge in itself, I think. 2 minutes to sum up, and also another opportunity for reflection, which I'm not sure whether we need another reflection to add to what we heard today on this panel and with the two speakers. I think we had an excellent introduction about what open government means today and what it may mean in the future, with some good thinking around concepts, around differences between open government and open data, and also quite a few challenges being put forward to us. So I actually would bounce this idea about reflection back to you and invite you to continue the debate, to continue to look for opportunities, to implement the ideas and suggestions put on the table here by this panel and by the introduction speakers, to make some progress in this area and to tackle the challenges introduced by the various speakers. So perhaps that as a reflection on what we heard today at the panel. I think in general New Zealand is making excellent progress if we compare it with other countries. Some excellent opportunities here to make some further progress with the innovative culture we have, the number 8 wire mentality in this country, relative high trust in government, agile government, more or less one layer of government where we need to deal with. So some interesting conditions to work with and to make some further progress in this area.
Thank you. So open government and opening government is about changing culture and about changing systems and processes, and that takes courage. It's not an easy thing to do, it's a hard thing to do. I wonder, I don't know, but I wonder how many countries elected representatives, government chief executive and commentator and someone from a large tech company would have the courage to sit on a panel together and be willing to discuss these issues in an open and participative way. So I think as Kiwis we can be encouraged that our culture gives us the opportunity to perhaps progress faster in this area than our neighbouring countries, although perhaps not Australia, because they've got PIA. So, thank you all for participating. Thank you very much. I hope you will thank our panel members for their time today.